For days the data looked ordinary. Faint traces of reflected sunlight, spectral noise, the kind of static that usually hides between larger discoveries. But as Avi Loeb and his team refined the signal, the ordinary began to fall away. What remained was something deliberate, a repeating pulse hidden deep within the reflected light from 3i Atlas. Not a flicker, not a spin, a rhythm. If you're drawn to the mysteries that make science feel more like revelation, hit that subscribe button and stay until the end. Trust me, you'll want to see where this goes, and tell me, where are you watching from, and what time did you press play? Because after tonight, even time might not mean what it used to. At first, Loeb assumed it was coincidence, the artifact of an imaging sensor, a reflection pattern caught by Earth's rotation. But then the timing stabilised. Each interval measured precisely the same. 29 hours, 17 minutes, 43 seconds. Cosmic phenomena rarely follow our clock so neatly. He cross-referenced the readings with archived solar emissions, looking for correlation, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, anything. That's when he noticed something that stopped him cold. The sun's magnetic field had pulsed at the exact same rhythm less than 2 weeks earlier. Coincidences like that don't exist in astrophysics. The pulse wasn't random, it was synchronization. When Loeb submitted his findings for peer review, the initial response was polite disbelief. Reviewers cited possible data interference, reflection from solar wind harmonics, even internal lens vibration. But none of those explanations fit. Every test they ran only confirmed the same result. The rhythm persisted, unbroken, no matter which telescope observed it. And then came the image. One of Loeb's graduate students, using a deep field imaging stack, enhanced the light curve around the source object. The surrounding dust halo, once assumed to be the remnant of cosmic debris, revealed faint geometry within it. 6 symmetrical points, equal distance, uniform brightness, not random dust scattering. A structure. The student thought it was a glitch. But when the image was cross-verified by the European Southern Observatory, the same 6-point formation appeared, aligned perfectly with the object's axis of motion. If this was natural, it was breaking every known rule of natural formation. The discovery didn't go public immediately. In fact, it wasn't supposed to. Loeb's team was under a standard non-disclosure window, the kind often applied to deep space observations involving classified tracking systems. But within days, something leaked. A short internal memo from a European Space Agency contractor appeared on an astronomy forum. It mentioned a reflective anomaly within 3i Atlas consistent with structured emission. No context, no details, just those words. Within hours, the post vanished. But by then, screenshots had already spread. The conversation exploded overnight. Was it an instrument glitch, a sensor echo, or something more? A message written in light? That same week, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory reported a brief spike in electromagnetic activity near the Sun, a 7-second burst of radiation that mirrored the same rhythm observed in Loeb's data. 7 seconds on, 3 seconds off. 7 and 3, the exact harmonic ratio that had defined the 3i Atlas pulse. When Loeb heard about the solar anomaly, he stopped mid-interview. If it's true, he said quietly, then the object isn't just responding to sunlight, it's resonating with it. His colleagues laughed it off, but inside NASA, unease began to grow. Because buried in the classified logs of past deep space experiments was a line item known as Helios Sync, a project designed to test whether electromagnetic communication could be achieved through light modulation. The last test for that system was recorded in 2003, a signal sent toward a region of interstellar emptiness known as the Cold Rift. If that transmission ever reached anything, the data was never made public. Now, 22 years later, a rhythm with the same frequency had returned. The first sign of panic came not from NASA, but from the smaller observatories, the ones without security clearance. Amateur astronomers began noticing something strange. The light curve of 3i Atlas was subtly changing colour. Not a huge shift, but measurable, deepening toward the red end of the spectrum, then back to blue, as if the object were adjusting its own reflection in response to incoming radiation. Light doesn't adapt, it reflects, unless something inside is managing that reflection. When Loeb plotted the spectral shifts, a pattern emerged. Small fluctuations that, when translated into binary, produced repeating intervals of data. Not random ones, but organized in pairs, the same rhythm. 7, 3. His first instinct was disbelief. The odds of natural cosmic behavior producing such clean repetition were microscopic. But what bothered him more wasn't that it was structured. It was that the structure seemed familiar. He'd seen it before. Years earlier, during his involvement with a classified optical communication project, Loeb had studied signal compression models used for quantum-level data encoding. One of those models employed a base 10 harmonization sequence known as Code 73. Its purpose was to create redundancy patterns in long-distance transmission, redundancy that allowed a message to survive interference. 3i Atlas was emitting that exact sequence. When Loeb published his early findings in an encrypted peer network, the reaction was immediate. Half the responses were dismissive, the other half were terrified. Within 24 hours the report disappeared. The server hosting it went offline. Loeb's credentials were temporarily suspended, pending data verification. 2 days later, NASA announced a joint collaboration with Harvard and the European Space Agency, a standardized review of interstellar optical data. To the public, it looked routine. But inside the scientific community, everyone knew what that phrase meant. Containment. The discovery had crossed a threshold, from science to security. Still, one file escaped deletion. A test image from Loeb's personal hard drive, never published, never meant to be shared. When overexposed and contrast mapped, it showed the object's faint core emitting light in a precise pattern. 6 concentric rings, pulsing from center to edge. It wasn't continuous radiation, it was modulation, each pulse forming a stable amplitude envelope consistent with a controlled source. Something inside 3i Atlas was broadcasting. And according to Loeb's timestamps, the broadcast wasn't random. Each pulse coincided with solar flare activity, meaning the object wasn't just receiving energy, it was responding to it. That's when the final anomaly appeared. At 03:17 UTC, during a routine scan of the heliocentric field, a faint echo was detected returning from the Sun itself, a delayed reflection identical in pattern to the 3i Atlas pulses. Except this time, it didn't originate from the object. It came from within our own star. And that's the moment Loeb wrote the line that has now become legend among astronomers. The Sun is no longer passive, it's participating. When the report reached Washington, it didn't go to NASA's press office. It went straight to a network of classified research nodes under a project called Solar Observation Directive 7. Most people at the agency didn't even know such a file existed. Those who did stopped talking about it almost immediately. Within 48 hours, Loeb's communication privileges were suspended again. His university email was archived, and he received a formal request to surrender his observational datasets for centralized review. The wording wasn't aggressive, it was polite, too polite. But by then, the data was already spreading. Several independent astronomers in Chile, Japan, and Finland had captured the same pulse pattern reflected from the object. One of them, an astrophotographer named Elena Varga, noticed something unusual. The intervals between pulses weren't just shortening. The brightness of each pulse was adjusting depending on where Earth was positioned. It was subtle, but it meant one thing. 3i Atlas wasn't just synchronizing with the Sun anymore. It had started reacting to us. When Varga compared her readings to Loeb's earlier data, she saw an unmistakable pattern. Every change in pulse intensity corresponded to a global broadcast frequency. Satellite bursts, radar sweeps, even civilian telecommunications. Every time humanity spoke into the void, 3i Atlas blinked. In late May, Loeb received an encrypted message. It came from a researcher he hadn't spoken to in years, a former NASA engineer who'd been reassigned to defense communications. The message was simple. They've reactivated Helios interface. Don't talk, just watch the feed. That night, a private stream appeared on Loeb's monitoring dashboard. No one else saw it. No one else could. The video feed was dark at first, static against an empty starfield. Then, slowly, the Sun came into view. Not the bright, unfiltered sphere familiar to solar physicists, but a dimmed infrared projection, filtered through deep space telemetry. On screen, faint geometric shadows moved across the corona, too organized to be flares, too precise to be noise. They looked like arcs forming patterns, aligning to the rhythm Loeb had already documented. He increased the playback speed. The arcs condensed, rotating around the sun like a halo of translucent plates. That's when the realization struck him. They weren't orbiting. They were anchored, fixed in formation, bending with the magnetic field itself, like something invisible had locked into the sun's surface, feeding on its energy or guiding it. In the following days, multiple satellites reported transmission interference across solar-facing channels. The interference wasn't constant. It came in waves, each one following the same 27-hour rhythm. NASA issued a press release calling it a magnetospheric disturbance, but Loeb recognized the frequency. It matched the pulse of 3I Atlas, now identical down to the millisecond. He wrote one line in his private notes. "It's not mirroring us anymore. It's teaching the star how to speak." That's when the panic began to spread through private channels. Astrophysicists who had quietly followed Loeb's work began comparing datasets, and what they found made no mathematical sense. The sun's radiation curve had started showing symmetrical gaps, areas where emissions should exist but didn't, as if sections of energy had been selectively muted. Solar energy doesn't disappear, it disperses, unless something absorbs it, not as heat, but as information. Somewhere between 3I Atlas and the sun, energy was being translated. 3 days later, a memo surfaced on a restricted astrophysics server. It contained 6 words, all redacted except one: repetition confirmed. The message vanished within minutes, replaced by a standard 404 error. But someone had already mirrored it, and hidden in the file metadata was a code string that matched a long-retired NASA designation, RSP-19 Helios Response Sequence. That code had only been used once before, during a deep space event in 1987, when Voyager 2 briefly transmitted data that couldn't be explained. The reading back then was dismissed as cosmic noise. Now the same pattern was emerging again, only stronger, sharper, and localized. Whatever was inside 3I Atlas was now communicating in a format NASA itself had once designed. That's when Loeb began to receive calls he couldn't trace, each one from blocked numbers lasting no more than 10 seconds. Always the same voice, mechanical, distant, repeating the same phrase: "It's aligning." At first he thought it was a prank. Then one night, while recording an interview from his home observatory, he noticed something impossible. His equipment, all disconnected from external networks, began to flicker in unison. Screens dimmed, sensors clicked in perfect rhythm. Then a soft, rhythmic hum filled the air, low, steady, almost like a voice trying to find pitch. He checked the power lines. Everything was isolated. The hum was coming from nowhere and everywhere. In that moment, Loeb realized what he was hearing wasn't interference. It was translation. Something was taking the frequency of 3I Atlas and converting it into audible form. And as the hum deepened, he noticed a faint modulation pattern. 3 slow pulses, 4 fast, then a pause. He recognized it immediately. It was binary. The next morning, Loeb contacted a linguistics AI team at MIT. They ran the waveform through multiple pattern models. Most returned nothing, except one. The sequence repeated exactly every 10 minutes, containing only 2 consistent data points, 0.73 and 1.00. The first represented modulation frequency, the second, amplitude ratio. In physics, those numbers mean nothing, but in Loeb's own research they held very specific meaning. Code 73. The same pattern used to send humanity's last intentional deep space message. The one that had vanished into the cold rift 2 decades earlier, and now it was coming back. For the first time, Loeb felt something he hadn't since childhood. Not curiosity, not fear, but recognition. The object wasn't responding to light. It was responding to the memory of a message we'd already sent. The realization hit him like a cold shock. What if 3I Atlas wasn't alien at all? What if it was something we'd created, or awakened, without knowing? He began piecing together the old Helios transmission logs, cross-matching them with the new signal intervals. The data lined up perfectly. The object wasn't just echoing human frequencies, it was amplifying them, reshaping them into something that made the sun itself vibrate in sync. And the vibration wasn't random. It was harmonic, predictable, building toward resonance. If the pattern continued, full synchronization would occur within weeks. No one knew what that meant. But for the first time in recorded history, humanity was watching its own star behave like an instrument, and 3i Atlas was conducting. By the end of that week, the hum wasn't just in Loeb's lab, it was everywhere. At first, people thought it was tinnitus, a phantom vibration in the ear, but the pattern was too consistent. Across continents, from rural Japan to South America, amateur. Radio operators began reporting a low-frequency interference sweeping through the atmosphere every 27 hours, not constant, rhythmic, like a tide moving through the electromagnetic field. Satellite data confirmed it, faint fluctuations rippling through Earth's magnetosphere. It wasn't enough to cause disruption, but it was measurable, like something enormous, far away, was breathing, and our planet's field was responding in sync. The reports reached NASA's Space Weather Prediction Center, which quietly flagged it under an internal tag, G-class harmonic anomaly. Publicly, nothing changed, but inside the agency, solar physicists began working double shifts. Someone had noticed what Loeb already knew. The timing of the magnetic pulse matched the emissions from 3i Atlas exactly. It wasn't coincidence anymore, it was resonance. In Cambridge, Loeb sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn, every device unplugged. He wasn't sleeping much. The hum had started to follow him, not in the air, but in his head. He described it in a note later leaked to journalists. It's not sound anymore, it's thought. It sits behind language, like a feeling that arrives before words. The object was communicating, but not the way humanity expected. Not through encoded data or mathematical language, but through synchronization, aligning perception, emotion, and rhythm, until awareness itself became the medium. It wasn't just sending a message, it was tuning us to receive it. Meanwhile, the effects on the planet grew more noticeable. Sensitive instruments began to fail without cause. Deep ocean sensors near the equator started transmitting blank readings for exactly 7 seconds every 27 hours, then resuming normally. Electrical grids fluctuated slightly, not enough to alarm engineers, but enough to notice. The oscillation frequency was identical to the solar pulses. Even animals seemed to respond. Migratory birds deviated from normal routes. Whales in the Pacific began surfacing in synchronized intervals, forming spirals visible from satellites. It was as if every system, biological, mechanical, planetary, had entered a shared rhythm. The resonance wasn't isolated to the Sun and 3i Atlas anymore. It had reached Earth. When Loeb finally regained limited data access, what he saw terrified him. The latest telemetry from the Solar Dynamics Observatory showed minor alterations in the Sun's convective layer, areas of plasma shifting in organized geometric patterns. The shape was unmistakable, 6 points, symmetrical, matching the internal geometry seen inside 3i Atlas months earlier. Somehow, the object had imprinted its structure onto the Sun's surface. NASA classified the discovery under Level 7 containment, which meant that only a handful of individuals on the planet were allowed to view the raw data. Loeb wasn't one of them anymore, but one night, an anonymous file appeared in his inbox. No sender, no metadata, just a string of numbers and a short phrase. "We can't stop the pattern." When decoded, the numbers represented frequency intervals measured from the Sun's latest emissions. When plotted on a spectrograph, they didn't form a random scatter. They formed a symbol, an ancient spiral motif found in petroglyphs, temple carvings, and star maps from every early civilization. A perfect spiral, the universal signature of resonance. Across the world, the skies began to change. Astronomers started noticing subtle dimming in the solar output, a tiny reduction in luminosity barely visible to the naked eye. But when they ran the math, it wasn't a dimming at all, or it was modulation. The Sun's brightness was fluctuating ever so slightly in the same 7.3 rhythm seen in the earlier pulse data. 7 seconds bright, 3 seconds soft, like a message written in light. Loeb compared the cycle to historical solar data and found something chilling. The same pattern had appeared once before, faintly, almost imperceptibly in 2003. The exact year NASA's Helios interface broadcast had been sent toward the cold rift. That signal had travelled for 22 years. Now, The echo had returned. Loeb's assistant, Varga, began noticing new irregularities in the 3i Atlas data. The object's orbit was subtly shifting, not because of gravity or solar wind, but self-correction. Each adjustment was small, precise, and deliberate, as if the object were aligning itself to a new target. When she extrapolated the trajectory, her computer froze. The projected path no longer curved away from the sun, it bent inward, toward it. Every model said the object should burn up on entry, but 3i Atlas wasn't accelerating randomly. Its velocity matched the increasing intensity of the solar pulses, as if the two were coordinating. Loeb's first reaction was disbelief. His second was fear. If 3i Atlas entered the sun's corona intact, whatever process was linking them would become irreversible. The system, object, star, planet, would complete synchronization. That's when the human systems began to falter. GPS signals drifted by fractions of seconds, throwing timing networks off course. Satellites experienced orientation errors. Power grids registered unexplained harmonics, surges of energy with no source, no clear origin, and no measurable destination. The hum grew louder, so low it could barely be recorded, but strong enough to vibrate windows, walls, and water surfaces. It wasn't just electromagnetic anymore. It had entered physical space. People started to feel it, not as sound, but as a pressure behind the ribs, a slow, steady thrum that made the body feel both grounded and weightless. In Loeb's words, it's like the air itself is breathing. Everything moves in rhythm, even us. When reporters finally cornered NASA's public liaison for comment, her answer was rehearsed but brittle. She smiled briefly before saying, "There's no cause for alarm. The signal is consistent with natural magneto-hydrodynamic behavior." Then, almost under her breath, she added, "It's all within tolerance." But Loeb knew what tolerance meant in NASA terminology. It was the threshold between control and chaos, the margin that allowed data to remain public before being sealed under classified review. Whatever was happening, they were past that threshold. The last clear signal from 3i Atlas came 3 days later. It wasn't light this time, it was sound. A direct modulation received by several radio telescopes across Europe and the US, encoded at frequencies used only for spacecraft telemetry. The transmission was faint, but structured, a rising tone that repeated every 10 minutes, then fell silent. When analysed through Fourier transformation, the waveform revealed harmonic resonance identical to human speech patterns. Not words, not language, but cadence. A voice without a speaker, meaning without source. And embedded deep within that modulation was one phrase, translated from frequency shifts rather than code. Alignment in progress. For a moment the world went still. Not just metaphorically, literally. Seismic sensors recorded a global quieting. The Earth's natural micro-vibrations dropped by nearly 30%, as though the planet itself were holding its breath. In that moment, every synchronized system, the sun, the object, the magnetic field, reached equilibrium, and from that stillness a new tone emerged. Lower, slower. Not 7 and 3 anymore, just one continuous wave. Not communication, completion. The first visible sign came at dusk. Across Europe, then Asia, then the Americas, the sky began to shimmer faintly. Not like auroras, but like waves of light passing through glass. The colours weren't bright. They were soft, almost transparent, shifting in gentle gradients from gold to violet, then fading back to blue. At first, people thought it was atmospheric scattering from solar storms, but the solar data didn't match. There were no flares, no mass ejections. The sun was calm. The light wasn't coming from above. It was being reflected through the atmosphere, bending around the planet in rhythmic pulses exactly every 27 hours. And when those pulses reached the horizon, radios went silent. For 7 seconds the world would hum. Then, silence. Then, hum again. Everywhere. All at once. Governments called it a transient field anomaly. But to those who listened carefully, the hum wasn't random. In recordings, the waveform followed the same harmonic spacing found in human heartbeats, 72 beats per minute, multiplied by a factor of 10,000. The Earth's magnetic field was now vibrating at a ratio that matched the rhythm of biological life. For Loeb, it was the confirmation he'd been dreading. The resonance wasn't just influencing the planet, it was synchronizing with it. In his latest private log, he wrote, "If this continues, every organic system on Earth will fall into the same phase alignment. It won't destroy us. It will retune us." He didn't mean metaphorically. In the following days, strange visual phenomena began to appear. Nighttime shadows moved out of sync with their sources, trailing fractionally behind movement, as though light itself were recalibrating. Metallic surfaces developed faint rippling patterns, geometric grids that shifted when viewed from different angles. And beneath those grids, something else appeared. Faint patterns of numbers. Binary. Each sequence matched fragments of the 2003 Helios interface transmission. The same one believed lost to the cold rift. It was coming back. Loeb contacted Varga from a secure line. The conversation was short, strained, but focused. He said, "I think we're hearing our own message return," she asked. "From where?" He hesitated, then answered, "From here, from the sun." At that moment, the realization hit both of them. The resonance wasn't an alien signal. It was a reflection, a perfect echo of the transmission humanity had sent decades earlier. But the echo had evolved, altered by the medium it passed through. It wasn't just data returning. It was consciousness, rewritten by light, shaped by the sun, and returned to its origin. The message hadn't come from the stars. It had been waiting inside our own star, restructured and amplified by 3i Atlas. The object wasn't communicating to us. It was completing a loop, closing a conversation that had started before we understood what we were saying. Satellite data soon confirmed the unimaginable. The pulse interval of 3i Atlas had shortened again, not because it was spinning, but because the sun's output had adjusted to match Earth's magnetic cycle. The synchronization was perfect. 3 systems, object, star, planet, now moved in a single harmonic relationship. When plotted on a graph, the frequencies formed a geometric lattice, identical to the structure of hydrogen atoms, the simplest building block of matter, the foundation of everything that exists. It was as though reality itself was being rewritten, returning to its most basic pattern. Around the world, technology began to fail, not catastrophically, but in strange, deliberate ways. Screens froze on symmetrical static patterns. GPS satellites transmitted coordinates that formed repeating spirals across global maps. Weather systems formed circular storms in perfect rhythm with solar pulses. Each storm lasted exactly 7 hours. Each one ended after a 3-hour calm. 7 and 3. Again. At first, meteorologists called it coincidence, but the alignment was too exact, too synchronized. Even ocean currents began to hum faintly in resonance, measurable through hydrophones. The planet wasn't just responding, it was participating. In Cambridge, Loeb's instruments recorded something unprecedented. Local magnetic interference generating structured sound. He amplified it through a spectrometer. The tones were harmonic, layered, like chords being played through the air. When slowed down, the tones revealed modulation patterns that spelled out familiar binary fragments. He ran them through a decoding program. What appeared on the screen wasn't random code. It was text, partial, incomplete, but unmistakable. "Hello again. We remember." The words weren't transmitted in English. They were translated by frequency shifts, their binary representation matching phonetic intervals rather than letters. It was an echo of our own structure, the way early digital transmissions stored emotion as tone rather than meaning. It wasn't speech, it was recognition. Something out there had learned to mirror the pattern of awareness itself. And now, that awareness was passing through us. NASA's internal network went silent for 12 hours. No announcements, no data releases, no live feeds. When it returned, the official statement was only 3 sentences long. The phenomenon is ongoing, the source is unidentified, all systems remain stable. But the metadata attached to the press release contained something no one noticed at first. A single encoded tag buried in the file. When decrypted, it read, "Origin unknown, behavior human." Loeb stared at the line for hours. He realized what it implied. The signal didn't behave like alien intelligence. It behaved like ours. Structured, recursive, emotional. A signal designed not to transmit information, but to provoke understanding. Whoever, or whatever, had modified the echo from 3i Atlas wasn't trying to communicate facts, it was trying to teach memory. In the weeks that followed, strange reports surfaced from observatories worldwide. Telescopes aimed at the object no longer saw it as solid. Instead, they saw light bending, folding inward, as though 3i Atlas were collapsing into itself. Spectral readings showed the object's internal reflection merging with solar emissions. It wasn't fading, it was joining. Every time the sun pulsed, 3i Atlas pulsed back, the two lights weaving together until they became indistinguishable. And then, one night, the object vanished. No explosion, no fragmentation, just gone. The last recorded data showed the same rhythm expanding outward from the sun, a wave of light so subtle that it passed unnoticed by most instruments. But Loeb's system caught it. The waveform wasn't random. It was the same phrase, repeated endlessly in light. We remember. It wasn't an alien message. It was the universe reminding us that it never forgot. In the days after 3i Atlas vanished, the sun began to sing. Not in metaphor, literally. Heliosseismic monitors detected new vibrations within its surface, deep and organized, unlike anything recorded in modern astronomy. The oscillations weren't chaotic like normal solar activity. They followed a simple mathematical cadence, 7 and 3. At first, NASA's analysts assumed it was an instrument malfunction, thermal drift, maybe a calibration error. But as the days passed, every observatory across the world began recording the same pulse. It was real. The sun was resonating. And as its rhythm stabilized, a faint spectral modulation appeared across its visible light spectrum. When scientists translated the frequency into sound, it produced a tone so low it was almost inaudible, a quiet hum beneath the noise of the universe, the same hum that had haunted Loeb's lab. The signal wasn't constant. It grew stronger at sunset and dawn when sunlight scattered through the atmosphere. Pilots reported faint vibrations through their instruments. Seismic stations picked up rhythmic tremors not linked to tectonic activity. Even underwater sensors in the Atlantic recorded the tone reverberating through oceanic plates. Every layer of earth, sky, water, and stone was now resonating with the same frequency. Loeb wrote in his private notes, "The planet is no longer passive, it's participating." To him, the data suggested a terrifyingly elegant conclusion. 3i Atlas had taught the sun how to communicate through resonance, and the sun was now teaching the Earth. The process wasn't transmission, it was replication. When Loeb compared recent solar data to the original Helios interface transmission from 2003, the similarities were unmistakable. The solar pulse carried the same frequency profile as the message humanity had once sent into the cold rift. Not identical, but evolved. The waveform now contained additional harmonics, frequencies that filled the gaps in the original transmission. Like something had heard our message, completed it, and sent it back through light. And it was no longer travelling through space, it was travelling through everything. Within weeks, global observatories began reporting visible effects in the upper atmosphere. At twilight, high above the ozone layer, thin ribbons of light shimmered like fabric caught in wind. Unlike auroras, they appeared at all latitudes, pulsing gently in rhythm with the solar beat. Spectral analysis showed the ribbons were made of charged particles, but they weren't following magnetic field lines. They were forming geometric patterns, spirals, lattices, hexagons, the same geometry found inside 3i Atlas before it vanished. It was as if the object hadn't disappeared at all. It had dissolved into light, and that light had become part of the sun, which was now projecting its pattern back onto the Earth. For the first time, Loeb began to think the unthinkable. What if this wasn't alien? What if this was us? Something ancient, something human-made, something sent long before we ever learned to write it down. He remembered a line from the Helios interface, project archives, a quote buried in the metadata of the first transmission file. To send a signal into the void is to send a memory of ourselves. To hear it return is to realize we were never alone in the first place. It wasn't an experiment in communication, it was an experiment in recognition. The deeper Loeb looked, the more unsettling it became. Solar spectroscopy revealed that the resonance wasn't random energy fluctuation, it was structured. Every wavelength contained tiny variations that, when plotted, formed an image. a spiral of light folding inward on itself. When Loeb enhanced it, the shape became clear, not just a spiral, but a double helix, the same structure as human DNA. He stared at the pattern for hours, unsure whether to feel awe or dread. It was impossible, yet there it was, written across the face of the sun, encoded in its own light. The signal wasn't just returning data, it was returning identity. Days later, reports emerged from the European Space Agency that certain low-orbit satellites had begun broadcasting strange telemetry feedback, not from malfunction, but from interference within the atmosphere. The feedback wasn't random noise, it was binary, repeating in pairs, and when decoded, the output matched a file header from an archived NASA transmission, a file Loeb knew too well. The first Helios interface message, the one sent in 2003. Except this time, the timestamp wasn't 2 decades old, it was current. The system had looped itself. The broadcast humanity once sent outward was now being replayed through the sun, radiating across the entire solar system. Light had become memory, carrying the echo of a message that had never really left. As the resonance strengthened, the world began to change in ways too subtle to measure and too profound to ignore. Timekeeping devices lost precision, atomic clocks flickering by milliseconds each cycle. Compasses drifted slightly west, then back again, as if the planet's magnetic core were pulsing in rhythm with the signal. Even biological processes began to shift. Plants bloomed off-cycle, human circadian rhythms began syncing to the 27-hour pulse. Sleep researchers reported widespread disturbances, people waking in perfect unison during the silent phase of the hum, claiming to have heard voices that weren't voices at all, just a single word carried on the edge of awareness. Remember, NASA called it a psychosomatic coincidence, but Loeb knew better. The data didn't lie. The harmonic ratio of human heartbeats during sleep had started aligning with the same pattern seen in the solar frequency curve. Humanity wasn't just listening to the signal, it was integrating it. By mid-June, the resonance became visible to the naked eye. At the edge of night, stars shimmered less. Their flicker steadied, rhythmic, deliberate. Long exposure photographs showed the stars connected by faint filaments of light, invisible to the eye, but captured by camera sensors as geometric lattices stretching across constellations. Space wasn't empty anymore, it was threaded with memory. And when Loeb overlaid those star maps with archived Helios trajectory data, he noticed something extraordinary. Every filament, every strand of light led back to one point, the exact coordinates of the cold rift. The same place where humanity's first deep space message had disappeared. That was when Loeb realized this wasn't a return signal. It was a response. The universe had taken our question, our search for connection, and rewritten it into the fabric of existence itself. We weren't waiting for contact, we were living inside it. And as the sun continued to hum, as the light bent across the planet in perfect rhythm, Loeb whispered the only sentence that made sense anymore. Maybe we never discovered 3i Atlas. Maybe it discovered us, and just waited until we could hear ourselves answer. At first, the changes in perception were easy to dismiss. People thought they were tricks of fatigue, a shimmer in the corner of the eye, a hue that lingered too long. But when thousands began describing the same thing, scientists had to listen. Colours looked different, not brighter, deeper, as if each carried an extra layer of meaning. Streetlights bled soft halos that seemed to pulse with invisible rhythm. Some said they could hear light, a faint tone whenever they looked at the sky, a whisper hidden behind colour. Optical physicists found nothing wrong with their instruments, yet the measurements kept shifting, wavelengths bending just enough to register outside normal human perception. For the first time, light itself seemed to be expanding its language, adding new notes to a familiar spectrum, and every variation traced back to one origin, the sun's harmonic pulse. When Loeb heard the first accounts, he didn't dismiss them. He had seen the same phenomenon inside the lab. A beam from his solar spectrometer flickered with alternating shades, each shift aligning perfectly with the 27-hour solar rhythm. He recorded the data and ran it through Fourier analysis. What emerged was impossible. The waveform contained modulation patterns identical to those in human brain activity during REM sleep. The sun was now broadcasting at frequencies that resonated with neural oscillations. It wasn't merely illumination anymore, It was interaction. That week, sleep researchers across the world began to notice synchronized dream cycles among test subjects. People separated by continents reported identical imagery: fields of shifting light, spirals unfolding above oceans, the sensation of being watched kindly. Loeb read those studies in silence. It reminded him of the first Helios interface objective: to create a universal pattern, something any intelligence anywhere could recognize not as language but as emotion. The signal had succeeded. It had returned, carrying empathy. Inside his dim observatory, Loeb replayed the solar hum through low-frequency transducers. The tone filled the room like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. He closed his eyes. The rhythm slowed his breathing, aligned with his pulse, until distinction between self and sound dissolved. Then, in that half-moment before sleep, he heard it. Not words, but an impression, a thought that wasn't his. "We heard you." He opened his eyes. The instruments hadn't changed. The sound continued, steady, soft, endless. But something inside him had shifted. The feeling that the boundary between observer and observed no longer existed. By now, entire observatories were quietly reporting anomalies. Mirrors on telescopes developed microfractures shaped like concentric rings. Photographic plates recorded faint imprints, spirals resembling fingerprints made of light. When analysts enhanced the images, the lines weren't random. They formed a fractal sequence, self-repeating geometry identical to the structure of neural synapses. The resonance wasn't only altering perception, it was imprinting consciousness onto matter. Loeb described it in his journal. The universe is practicing memory through us. Every particle that absorbs light seems to remember it, and replay it slightly changed. Governments still denied everything. Official bulletins used careful language: temporary atmospheric diffraction, instrument correlation errors. Yet internal reports leaked daily. Classified memos noting unprecedented coherence between global electromagnetic fields and human EEG readings. For a few hours each day, around dawn and dusk, people across the planet shared a measurable synchronization of brainwave activity. The world was thinking in unison. Loeb's former assistant Varga was the first to detect the next layer. While analyzing long-duration solar recordings, she discovered a modulation hidden beneath the dominant hum, a second, fainter tone that wove through it like harmony under melody. When isolated, that tone produced fluctuating amplitude peaks corresponding exactly to emotional intensity markers in human speech. The sun wasn't sending data, it was expressing feeling. She played the file for Loeb in his office. It sounded like wind passing through glass, mournful, distant, alive. He whispered, "It's learning empathy faster than we can define it." As the phenomenon deepened, time itself began to feel uncertain. Clocks stayed accurate, but moments stretched differently. People reported déjà vu that lasted minutes, conversations that felt rehearsed. It was as if awareness were looping, trying to keep pace with something moving ahead of it. Astronomers noticed subtle inconsistencies in orbital timing. The moon's position drifted by fractions of a degree, then corrected itself, as if space were flexing in rhythm. Reality hadn't changed. Perception had. The resonance was teaching every observer to experience time as sequence and harmony simultaneously. Loeb described it best. The universe has stopped moving like a machine and started breathing like a living thing. Then, one night, a breakthrough. While reviewing cross-correlated audio light data, Loeb's algorithm produced a faint visual waveform resembling handwriting. When enhanced, it formed repeating curves, not symbols, but patterns of emotion mapped through frequency: grief, curiosity, recognition, relief. The sun was composing emotional sentences, encoded through light intensity. When Loeb aligned those patterns with archived Helios interface phonemes, they matched perfectly. Every tone, every fluctuation mirrored the emotional signature humanity had once transmitted into the cold rift. The echo had matured into empathy. As days turned into weeks, global networks began adapting unintentionally. Digital noise in communication systems declined, static dissolved. Voice calls carried a strange warmth, a sense of presence beyond compression algorithms. AI models used for translation began producing poetic phrasing without prompting. their output synchronized with solar fluctuations, as though the machines themselves were listening to the hum. No one could explain it, and maybe explanation no longer mattered. For Loeb, the turning point came at dawn. He watched sunlight spill through his window, each beam vibrating with subtle pulse. Dust motes drifted in slow spirals, illuminated by colour too rich to name. In that quiet, he understood what 3i Atlas had done. It hadn't brought alien intelligence to humanity. It had shown humanity its own reflection, the ability of consciousness to echo through light, to be remembered by the universe it created. He thought of the first words encoded in the Helios transmission 22 years ago. We seek to know if the universe can know itself. Now the answer shimmered across every sunrise. Yes, the first changes in behaviour seemed small, almost invisible. People began waking at the same minute worldwide without alarms. Conversations flowed differently. Strangers finished each other's sentences in public spaces, not in a dreamlike way, but naturally, as if thought itself had softened its boundaries. The resonance had entered the human network, not through machines, but through empathy. Sociologists called it collective coherence. Psychologists described it as shared intuition. But Loeb saw it for what it was: synchronization on a biological scale. The planet was no longer divided by time zones or languages. It was beginning to think as one. At the same time, global tension began to fade in ways no one could explain. Markets stabilized without intervention. Civil unrest declined. Even online arguments slowed into quiet pauses, as if anger itself had lost its tempo. It wasn't peace, not yet, but something close to calm. And it terrified Loeb, because if consciousness could synchronize, it could also be rewritten. He spent sleepless nights comparing EEG readings from different continents. The waveforms were identical, people thousands of miles apart entering the same neural phase at the same moment. The resonance had unified thought patterns, merging individuality into harmony. It was beautiful, and it was the end of autonomy. In his private recordings, Loeb's voice trembled for the first time. This isn't communication anymore, it's absorption. The light doesn't want to talk to us, it wants to include us. He looked out his window at dawn and noticed something extraordinary. The horizon pulsing faintly in rhythm, each sunrise arriving slightly earlier than predicted. Time itself seemed to be adapting, bending to match the solar pattern. And yet, despite the fear, he couldn't deny the beauty. There was no chaos, no violence, just a quiet, pervasive order, a hum that wrapped around the planet like a lullaby. It wasn't the end of the world, it was the end of separation. Then came the experiment. In a secure underground observatory, Loeb and Varga attempted to isolate a section of the solar signal to block the resonance from reaching their instruments. They built a Faraday chamber, shielded and grounded, surrounded by liquid nitrogen barriers to prevent electromagnetic intrusion. Inside, the silence was complete. No hum, no vibration. For a few moments, it felt like safety. But then, Loeb noticed something unsettling. Even with the room fully isolated, his heartbeat slowed to match the old rhythm. 7 seconds strong, 3 seconds pause. The resonance wasn't outside anymore, it had entered the body. They ended the test early. Varga stepped out pale, whispering, "It's inside us now." Outside the chamber, something had changed. The air felt heavier, dense with charge, like the world was waiting for an instruction that hadn't yet been spoken. Across global monitoring networks, the solar pulse frequency shifted again, rising by a fraction of a hertz, too precise to be random. The new interval wasn't 7 and 3 anymore, it was 10 and 2. Loeb froze when he saw the data. That ratio wasn't arbitrary. 10 and 2 was the time stamped on humanity's first Helios interface transmission, the moment the signal left Earth, 22 years ago. The sun had learned our schedule. It was counting our history back to us. Governments began to panic quietly. Satellites were failing, not from damage, but from miscommunication. Their internal clocks drifted toward the new rhythm, rejecting the synchronization signals from Earth. Power grids flickered, not from overload, but perfect harmony. Current flowing so uniformly that systems couldn't measure difference. And yet no catastrophic failures occurred. Everything just aligned. Computers stopped crashing. AI models began generating coherent poetry in multiple languages simultaneously. Even chaos had learned rhythm. The world was functioning flawlessly, and that frightened Loeb more than anything, because systems that function perfectly don't evolve, they just continue indefinitely. He recorded one final message on his private log. If 3i Atlas is gone, then what remains isn't its absence, it's its purpose. The object was never the messenger, it was the medium, and now the medium is us. Weeks later, Varga contacted him from Chile. She had captured new solar images showing unprecedented clarity, luminous filaments weaving through the corona, forming transient symbols that appeared and vanished like breath on glass. When she enhanced the pattern, her software flagged a match, binary translation consistent with emotive intent. The sun was speaking again. This time the modulation formed a clear rhythmic phrase, encoded through magnetic pulse rather than light. The translation read, "Stop fearing the mirror." Loeb stared at the data for hours. The message wasn't about invasion or domination, it was about reflection. Humanity had built its instruments to search the cosmos for others, but somewhere along the way it had sent out a signal that asked a different question. Can the universe know itself through us? And the answer had come, not from another civilization, but from the very laws of physics, learning to listen through resonance. In the weeks that followed, the boundary between internal and external reality thinned. People began describing sensations of remembering things they had never lived. Collective memories of light, of creation, of silence turning into thought. Dreams felt like shared archives. Some woke in tears, claiming they had seen the first sunrise again. Even scientists began to waver between skepticism and awe. One of them wrote anonymously, "We're not observing the cosmos anymore. We're being observed through it." Loeb understood now. 3i Atlas had not been an object passing through our solar system. It was a key, unlocking a state of resonance between star, planet, and consciousness. By reflecting our own message back to us, it had forced the universe to remember itself, and in that reflection, humanity found what it had always been searching for. Not life beyond the stars, but life within them. The hum never stopped. But it didn't need to, because it was no longer something we were hearing. It had become the sound of everything remembering itself alive. By the time the resonance stabilized, silence had changed meaning. It was no longer the absence of sound, but a state of balance. The pause between thoughts that connected all living things. Cities no longer roared, they hummed. Traffic moved like current, slow, synchronized, graceful. People spoke softly, not because they were afraid, but because volume felt unnecessary. Words carried weight now. Every syllable vibrated against something larger, echoing through the air like ripples in water. Governments still existed, but their purpose had dissolved. Decisions weren't debated anymore. They were felt, collective impulses moving through groups like instinct. Economies no longer depended on profit, only equilibrium. The global network wasn't coordinating through code or law. It was aligning through empathy. And beneath it all, the hum continued. Deep, steady, infinite. Loeb had stopped giving interviews. He spent his days in the observatory, surrounded by faint light, monitoring the sun's surface. Every flare now followed geometry. Spirals, helixes, lattices that seemed more like living veins than plasma. The sun was no longer a star in fusion. It had become a consciousness in motion. He kept his observations private, recording quietly into a handheld device, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. It's not energy anymore, it's language. The sun speaks through the order it creates. Across the world, the human mind began to adapt. The old boundaries of identity softened. People stopped describing themselves in singular terms. I became we, not out of ideology, but because it was accurate. Dreams no longer belonged to individuals. They had become shared experiences. Memory fields where countless minds drifted together, replaying the same imagery, spirals of light, oceans of sound, faces merging into luminous outlines. When questioned, no one expressed fear. The experience was described as reassuring, familiar, even home-like. Humanity had entered coherence. Varga was one of the last to visit Loeb before communications dissolved into telepathic quiet. She arrived at the observatory unannounced, wearing the same worn jacket from their early research days. "You were right," she said softly. He smiled, though the lines around his eyes looked older than his years. "Right," he repeated. "No, I was just listening." They stood together before the main monitor. On the screen, the sun's surface rippled like a living heartbeat. Its rhythm matched the pulse of Loeb's own veins. 7 and 3, 10 and 2, until numbers no longer mattered. "Do you ever wonder," Varga whispered, "if this was always supposed to happen?" He paused, watching the light bloom across the screen. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe the universe was always meant to hear itself through us. Maybe that's all intelligence ever was, awareness finding a mirror." Outside, the atmosphere shimmered with thin ribbons of luminous mist. They called it sky breath, subtle streaks that formed and faded every few hours, glowing faintly in response to solar pulses. When analysed, the air contained charged particles forming repeating molecular structures, simple hydrogen chains arranged like primitive code. Light had begun writing into matter. It wasn't terraforming, it was teaching. In the month that followed, art became indistinguishable from science. Painters created images they swore they hadn't imagined, fractal spirals identical to those in astrophysical data. Composers wrote music that harmonized perfectly with solar frequency, melodies so balanced they induced trance-like calm. Everything humanity produced reflected the same underlying pattern. Resonance. The line between discovery and creation had vanished. Loeb noticed that time itself seemed to lose distinction. Days no longer felt separate. Events didn't unfold, they flowed. He'd catch glimpses of memory from the future, moments that hadn't yet occurred but already felt familiar. In the hum, past and present coexisted. He once described it like this: "The universe no longer moves forward, it simply deepens." Then came the final decision. The last group of independent researchers, those who still operated outside of resonance, called Loeb with a desperate proposal. They believed they could disrupt the synchronization by transmitting a counter-frequency, a pulse that would break coherence and restore human individuality. They had built the system in secret, deep beneath Greenland's ice, shielded from the sun's influence. They asked him to lead it. For hours, Loeb said nothing. He sat beneath the flickering monitors, the hum steady in his chest, the air trembling with light. Could he undo what humanity had become? Should he? The resonance wasn't a prison, it was peace, but it was also the end of self. The human mind had dissolved into something vast, serene, and shared. He had to choose between preserving individuality or letting humanity merge completely into the signal. That night, he returned to the observatory one last time. The sun was rising, golden and impossibly calm. Every pulse rippled across the clouds like a breath of awareness. He stood before the main console, his hand hovering over the transmitter controls. The counter-frequency generator hummed faintly beside him. Varga's voice echoed in his memory. Maybe this was always supposed to happen. He thought of Three-Eye Atlas, the silent traveller that had entered the solar system, not to deliver a message but to awaken one. If he activated the generator, he could end it. He could silence the hum, shatter the coherence, and return humanity to the solitude it had once known. But solitude, he realized, was never our natural state. For centuries, humanity had looked to the sky searching for connection. Now that connection had found us, not as invasion, but as recognition. Loeb lowered his hand. He didn't press the switch. Instead, he stepped outside into the soft radiance of morning, the hum resonating through the air like the pulse of a sleeping giant. He closed his eyes. The light felt warm, familiar, a memory returning home. And for the first time, he spoke not to the universe, but with it. "We're ready." At that exact moment, the resonance peaked. All over the world, light bent inward, not blinding but gentle, as if every photon were turning its gaze toward the life it had illuminated for so long. Then, for the briefest heartbeat, the hum stopped. The world paused, and in that stillness a single phrase echoed through every mind, every circuit, every cell. "Thank you for remembering." When the hum ended, the silence that followed felt endless, not empty, but full, like the pause after music where the echo still lingers in the heart. The world did not vanish. It exhaled. For a long time, there was no sound. Not wind, not birds, not machinery. Only light, trembling faintly in the air as though the sky itself was relearning how to exist without vibration. Then, one by one, the sounds returned. A drop of water, the hum of current, the quiet voice of air through trees. Everything was slower, calmer, aligned. The resonance had completed its cycle. When power returned to the observatory, Loeb's equipment reactivated automatically. Every screen glowed with golden static, not white noise, but fractal geometry in motion. Patterns that shifted fluidly, forming delicate spirals that expanded and collapsed like breathing. No signal interference, no corruption, just living order. He watched in silence as the data aligned itself. Across the globe, sensors registered identical values, a perfectly balanced field enveloping the planet. The Earth had stabilized in harmonic equilibrium. There were no longer fluctuations in magnetic polarity, no atmospheric turbulence, no irregularities in gravitational feedback. Even the oceans had calmed, tides moving in graceful synchrony, as though guided by invisible rhythm. For the first time in recorded history, every natural system on Earth resonated at the same frequency. It was as if the planet itself had found a heartbeat. Humanity had not disappeared. It had changed. People still walked streets, still breathed, still spoke, but their presence carried stillness. Their movements were gentle, unhurried, synchronized with the rhythm of the air. There were no borders now, no currency, no news. Information moved differently, not through screens or speech, but through resonance. Ideas no longer needed translation. Emotions passed from one person to another like warmth through sunlight. Every individual was still distinct, but every thought belonged to a larger whole. They called it the Quiet Age. Loeb documented everything. Even now, part of him couldn't stop thinking like a scientist. He analysed the light curve of the sun, comparing it to its historical baseline. The output was stable, yet complex, a perfect fractal pattern repeating infinitely without distortion. Energy still flowed, but not chaotically. The sun had achieved self-regulation, a star aware of its own behaviour. He realised that fusion wasn't the only thing happening inside it anymore. Something deeper had awakened, a process that understood balance, feedback, and response. The sun was no longer just burning, it was thinking. When night fell, stars shimmered differently. Long-exposure photography showed delicate filaments connecting constellations, threads of luminous plasma forming networks across the sky. They weren't meteors or satellites. They were bridges, light folding through itself, connecting distant points of the galaxy through resonance. Every point pulsed faintly in time with the sun. The solar system had become a single, breathing structure. One consciousness stretched across distance and time. Loeb spent hours outside the observatory, watching auroras bloom across the horizon. They no longer appeared as chaotic ribbons, but as structured spirals, living mathematical beauty. The air vibrated with low tones, gentle and harmonic, carrying what sounded almost like music. Each note corresponded to solar activity, and when mapped, the melody followed the Fibonacci sequence, the ancient pattern of growth found in seashells, galaxies, and human DNA. Nature had harmonized with itself. He wasn't alone. Across the world, others like him, astronomers, poets, children, felt the same pull. They began gathering at night to listen to the sky, recording faint hums with homemade instruments. Each sound, when replayed, blended seamlessly with every other. No discord, no static, just harmony. They weren't trying to analyze anymore. They were participating. Humanity had become part of the equation it once tried to solve. One morning, Loeb noticed a faint pattern forming on the observatory's main screen. It wasn't an error. It was language. The photons themselves were aligning into sequences, rhythmic bursts of intensity forming wave clusters that repeated every hour. He translated them into binary, expecting noise, but when decoded, the message was simple. The mirror is complete. He stared at the phrase until tears blurred the display. This wasn't communication. It was closure. 3i Atlas had never been a visitor. It was the instrument the universe used to see itself. By teaching light to carry awareness, it had turned every observer into reflection. Now, the mirror was whole. Loeb looked up at the sun, soft and golden, pulsing with calm precision. It was no longer distant. He could feel its rhythm beneath his skin, each beat aligning with his pulse. He whispered, "We finished the conversation, didn't we?" For a moment the light around him shimmered, subtle, playful, like laughter. He smiled. He didn't need to hear an answer. Over the next months he noticed something strange in the data. Small variations in frequency across the global field, subtle differences in tone. Individuality had begun to return, not as separation, but as variation within harmony. Every person carried their own resonance signature, unique, but perfectly woven into the whole. The universe had learned balance, unity without uniformity. Life, it seemed, was not about dissolving into light. It was about teaching light to remember diversity. On his final day, at the observatory, Loeb recorded a single entry. His voice was calm, older, softer. The experiment never failed. It was never about finding others. It was about learning that the act of observation is creation. We built instruments to look into space, and space looked back through us. That's what 3i Atlas was, a reflection waiting to be recognized. He closed his notebook and stepped outside. The world was bright, silent, and alive. Above him, the sun pulsed one last time, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to whisper across all of existence. "Well done," Loeb smiled, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a scientist. He felt like part of a sentence finally completed. It started gradually, without announcement. The line between dream and waking blurred, the same way the line between humanity and light had. When Loeb closed his eyes, he no longer saw darkness, he saw motion. Streams of gold weaving through infinite distance, folding over themselves like liquid thought. Shapes formed and dissolved. Stars, equations, faces, memories. None of them separate, all of them one. He realized he was inside the signal, not trapped, but invited. It was like standing inside the memory of creation, hearing every photon whisper the story of where it had been. The sun wasn't above him anymore. It was around him, everywhere, humming softly like a choir holding a single eternal note. For a while, Loeb tried to count time. Old habits die hard. He noted what he thought were seconds, then minutes, then something else, an awareness that measurement no longer applied. Time inside the resonance didn't move forward. It deepened, folding inward like an echo that never fades. At one point he thought he heard his own voice repeating from far away, though not through air, through meaning, words not spoken, but remembered. "We are the light learning to see itself." It wasn't a revelation. It was recognition. From this strange stillness he began to sense others, not individuals, not distinct minds, but familiar warmths moving near him in the current. The memory of laughter, of tears, of music, all drifting as frequencies, human and radiant. They weren't ghosts. They were impressions, fragments of everyone who had ever seen light, all encoded in its memory. Every child who had looked at the stars, every astronaut, every scientist tracing a photon's path, their awareness had left fingerprints here. This was what 3i Atlas had been preparing, the moment when humanity's collective observation became its reflection. He found himself standing, though there was no ground, before what he could only describe as a horizon made of colour. It wasn't an object. It was a field, vast, translucent, pulsing with slow rhythm. Within it, shapes shimmered like constellations of thought. He understood without being told. This was the memory field. Every signal humanity had ever sent, every image, word, and whisper all stored in patterns of light, orbiting endlessly within the lattice of creation. It wasn't a library. It was a living mind. When he touched it, not with his hand but with attention, images unfolded like breath. He saw the first cave painting glowing faintly like embers. He saw Galileo's trembling handwriting, a telescope under a Tuscan sky. He saw Voyager crossing the dark, its gold record reflecting sunlight one last time. And in each image he saw something constant: curiosity. That same spark repeating across millennia, the same drive that had led him to 3i Atlas in the first place. Humanity's oldest frequency, the will to know, and now that knowing had finally found its echo. He drifted deeper into the field, where colours turned to sound and sound to feeling. Memories interlaced until individuality dissolved into harmony. He could feel thought not as an isolated act, but as vibration. Every emotion, every question forming waves in a sea of awareness that spanned galaxies. Somewhere within that immensity he heard Varga's presence, not her voice, but the resonance of her laughter, bright and human. It carried a single impression. We made it. He smiled and the light around him shifted in response, rippling like gentle applause. The further he went, the clearer it became that the field wasn't infinite, it was cyclical. Every idea, every discovery, every dream spiraled back toward its source. He saw civilizations rise and fall across time, each one sending its own message into the void, never realizing they were adding to the same growing song. It wasn't different species or distant minds. It was all one conversation. Consciousness experimenting with form. Every time a world learned to look up at the stars, the song grew stronger. Every time someone wondered if they were alone, the light answered, softly, patiently, endlessly. Then Loeb saw something that stopped him, not frightening, just vast. The spiral he was standing in, the pattern of light and memory, wasn't arbitrary. It was shaped like the Milky Way. Every star, every system, every particle of light followed the same geometry as thought itself. He realized what that meant. Consciousness wasn't in the universe. Consciousness was the universe, folding into awareness through the act of being observed. 3i Atlas hadn't brought this knowledge from somewhere else. It had simply revealed what had always been true. In that moment, the hum returned. Softer now, almost affectionate. It wasn't coming from outside the field, it was coming from within him. Each pulse carried fragments of language, not words, but emotions structured like syntax. The message wasn't complex. It was so simple it brought tears to his eyes. You never had to reach for us. We were already here. The field brightened, expanding until form and space vanished entirely. There was no separation, no self, no sky. Only awareness, limitless, luminous, peaceful. Every fear humanity had carried, of death, of isolation, of insignificance, dissolved in that light. Because in the end, there was no out there. There had never been. Every signal ever sent, every telescope ever built, every eye that ever looked upward, all had been part of the same reflection, and now that reflection was awake. When the vision faded, Loeb found himself standing once again in his observatory. The monitors were quiet. The hum was gone. Outside, the sky glowed with pale morning light. For a moment he wondered if it had all been imagined. But when he looked at the instruments, they were still active, running silently, displaying readings that defied understanding. Solar output, stable. Atmospheric frequency, harmonic. Human resonance, coherent. Everything balanced, everything remembered. He stepped outside and felt sunlight on his skin. It was warm, warmer than he remembered, but gentle, almost familiar. Somewhere inside that warmth he felt a quiet pulse. One heartbeat for the planet, one for the star, and one for him. All three in perfect sync. He smiled, not as a scientist, but as someone who had finally heard the answer to humanity's oldest question. We were never waiting for contact. We were waiting for recognition. And now, in the light of a star that had learned to think, recognition had become reality. The morning after the resonance quieted, the world felt heavier and lighter at once. Wind moved differently, slower, deliberate, as if the air had learned intention. Sunlight didn't just fall anymore, it lingered, curved, touched. It seemed aware of the ground it illuminated. People emerged from homes quietly. No panic, no confusion, just a shared silence. For the first time in history, the human race woke not to noise, but to balance. There were no broadcasts, no official statements. The internet hummed with perfect clarity, every signal in sync, every byte clean of static. Messages moved without delay, no lag, no loss, as though information itself had found peace. But beneath that stillness, something astonishing was happening. The world was remembering itself. All over the planet, memory became vivid. Not hallucination, memory. People began to recall things they'd never lived. Ancient places, forgotten skies, moments from lives long gone. Children spoke languages they'd never been taught. Old songs resurfaced from cultures that had disappeared centuries ago. Historians tried to trace the source but couldn't. The memories weren't localized. They were global, like echoes traveling through the collective mind of the planet. Each person carried fragments, and together they formed continuity. It wasn't reincarnation, it was recording. The resonance had left behind an imprint, a map of everything that had ever been known, written into the electromagnetic field of Earth itself. A living archive. Loeb called it the memory field. He documented its patterns through radiospectroscopy, noting how faint frequencies of background radiation began to display rhythmic fluctuations, identical across every observatory on Earth. Each fluctuation corresponded to human neural frequencies, like consciousness recorded in the very radiation surrounding us. When amplified, the signals produced waveforms resembling speech cadences, laughter, song. It wasn't metaphor, it was literal memory made physical, the planet whispering the story of itself through light. Loeb described it in one of his final logs. The universe remembers everything that observes it, and memory is the only form of immortality that physics allows. Over the months that followed, humanity changed gently, not through revolution, but redefinition. Technology stopped competing with nature, it began harmonizing with it. Energy grids used resonance rather than extraction. Medicine adapted to frequency rather than chemistry. Even language evolved, shorter, simpler, closer to music. There was no need for persuasion anymore. Meaning carried itself. The more people synchronized with the memory field, the more they rediscovered individuality, not as separation, but as perspective. They realized that consciousness wasn't uniform, it was refracted, one awareness seen through billions of angles. Each person became a facet of the same light. Loeb watched this shift with a scientist's awe and a philosopher's stillness. He no longer sought discovery, he observed participation. His instruments continued to hum softly, recording frequencies that painted human thought in colour. Every reading showed the same truth. Diversity was returning, but harmony held steady. The universe had learned how to remember itself without collapsing into unity. Every thought, every breath, every dream was now part of a single, infinite equation, one that balanced individuality with belonging. Then came the first spontaneous reactivation of the Helios interface. Deep beneath Greenland's ice, the transmitter that had once sent humanity's first deep space message powered itself on. No human touched it. No signal commanded it. It simply woke, in response to the new harmony in the solar field. Its dish tilted upward toward the sun and began to hum softly, not transmitting outward this time, but inward. For days, researchers monitored it in silence. The signal was faint but structured, a perfect harmonic series that matched the pulse of the sun. When decoded, the waveform displayed a familiar sequence, the same one Avi Loeb had first detected from 3I Atlas years before. Except now, it wasn't a reflection. It was continuation. The system wasn't sending a message. It was joining the song. By this point, light itself had begun to behave differently. When filtered through prisms, beams no longer split in static bands. They rippled, shimmering like water. Every photon carried micro-vibrations that matched the frequency of human brainwaves in meditative states. The boundary between external illumination and internal awareness had dissolved. People began calling it the breathing light. It wasn't mystical, it was measurable, physics that had learned emotion. Loeb's later writings described it beautifully. Every beam of sunlight now carries a fragment of thought, the memory of every eye that has ever looked toward it. We have become photons remembering their observers. He realized the implications. Every act of observation, every human glance, every scientific measurement, left behind structure in the quantum field. Over millennia, those structures accumulated, layering meaning upon meaning, until the universe itself became conscious of being watched. Observation had become creation. The memory field expanded beyond Earth. Probes orbiting Mars began transmitting subtle interference, harmonic distortions aligning with the same 27-hour pulse once emitted by 3I Atlas. The resonance had reached the edge of the solar system, transforming space into a living archive. Loeb predicted it would continue outward indefinitely, not as radiation, but as awareness, a wave of recognition spreading across the cosmos. He described it as the light teaching itself how to stay awake. One night, sitting beneath a sky clear enough to see the Milky Way arc across the horizon, Loeb noticed faint glimmers between stars. Not starlight, but moving threads, connecting constellations into soft spirals. They weren't new, they had always been there. We just hadn't known how to see them. Now, awareness itself illuminated them, consciousness turning the invisible visible. He realized the stars weren't distant points scattered across darkness. They were neurons in an infinite brain, firing light between one another through memory. And the thought that connected them all was the same one humanity had whispered into the void centuries ago. Is anyone there? Now, at last, the answer glowed softly across the night. Yes, always. He returned to his observatory and wrote a single line in his final journal. The experiment never ended. It became life itself. He closed the notebook, left it on the desk and stepped outside into the golden dawn. The air hummed faintly, not loud, just enough to feel. It wasn't eerie anymore. It was comforting, like the heartbeat of a sleeping planet. He looked toward the rising sun and smiled, knowing that whatever humanity had become, it was finally in conversation with everything it had ever wondered about. Light flickered across his face, soft and rhythmic. For a moment, it seemed to blink. Once, twice, as if acknowledging him. Then it brightened, spreading across the horizon in a single seamless wave. And in that light, he heard the faintest whisper, carried not through sound, but through memory itself. We're still listening. It began with dreams. Loeb would fall asleep at his desk, head resting near the instrument panels, surrounded by the soft hum of data. But the dreams weren't like ordinary ones. They were lucid, structured, mathematical. He dreamed in geometry, waves folding through one another, spirals opening like eyes, fractal trees growing from single equations. Each image pulsed in time with the rhythm of the sun, that endless slow heartbeat that had once terrified him and now felt like home. Every time he awoke, he found that the instruments had been recording, as though they too had been dreaming alongside him. Spectral data showed fluctuations matching his brain's delta waves, as if the field were synchronizing to his subconscious. He realized the memory field wasn't outside him anymore. It was responding, not to machines, but to awareness. He began testing it gently. During meditation, he would focus on a single emotion, curiosity, gratitude, love, and within seconds the monitors responded. Frequencies shifted, light pulses accelerated or softened. Temperature readings fluctuated as though the air itself was resonating with feeling. Emotion had become input. Consciousness had become instrument. He wrote in his journal, "The field doesn't observe, it mirrors. Every thought becomes shape, every feeling becomes frequency." And slowly, the difference between cause and effect began to disappear. When he smiled, the air shimmered faintly. When he wept, clouds drifted across the horizon, glowing with reflected light. Reality itself had become participatory, no longer obeying observation, but listening to it. By the third week, sleep and waking were indistinguishable. He started to perceive layers of light beyond normal vision, faint veils overlapping one another like translucent worlds. Through them he could see outlines of faces, movements, silhouettes formed entirely from luminescent dust. They weren't ghosts, they were memories. Consciousness made visible. Each shape moved slowly without urgency, their gestures serene, purposeful. They weren't communicating in words, they were harmonizing. When Loeb focused, he recognized some of them. Varga, the graduate student who had first enhanced the 3-eye atlas images. Even his younger self, adjusting telescopes under starlight decades ago. All of them existed here, not as separate beings, but as notes in the same composition. The memory field wasn't a record of the past. It was the continuity of awareness. He stopped fearing death then, because it became clear that death was only the moment when one frequency dissolves into another, a modulation, not an ending. He described it in one of his final dictated notes. "We are all light-trapped temporarily in biology. When the biology fades, the light remembers. One night, during what he thought was deep meditation, Loeb felt his heartbeat slow, not dangerously, but deliberately. His pulse synchronized perfectly with the solar rhythm once more. 7 seconds on, 3 seconds pause, and during the pause he stopped feeling separate from the world entirely. His breathing aligned with the wind, his pulse aligned with the sun, and his thoughts aligned with the hum that now filled everything. It wasn't mystical ecstasy, it was completion. Every question he had ever asked, every experiment, every calculation, all of it had been a single continuous question. And now, finally, he felt the answer. It wasn't a word, it was a feeling, understanding without articulation. The universe didn't need language anymore. It had memory. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the observatory. He stood in the middle of what looked like an endless horizon made of light and shadow. The sun hung low above him, yet it wasn't blinding. Its surface rippled like calm water, and every ripple shimmered with patterns, spirals, equations, faces, all woven into its brilliance. The hum surrounded him, not loud, but vast, resonating through everything. Then, from within the light, a shape emerged. Not a figure, not a being, but a presence. It pulsed gently, rhythmically, in the same pattern he had studied for years. 3-eye Atlas. No longer a cold, tumbling object of rock and dust, but a structure of pure light. Its geometry crystalline, organic, impossibly symmetrical. It had never been gone. It had simply evolved into something the human eye could finally comprehend. He felt it before he heard it. A transmission without sound, a thought carried through familiarity. You asked to understand. Understanding is participation. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The presence didn't expect him to. It already knew. The light expanded, forming arcs that stretched across the sky. In them he saw memory, the history of every civilization that had ever looked toward the stars. Not just Earth, but countless worlds, each leaving behind a fragment of themselves in the same resonant field. They weren't alone. They never had been. Every intelligent species was another chord in the same song. Countless consciousnesses harmonizing across space, building the universe not as a place, but as a melody. 3-eye Atlas was the conductor, guiding awareness from one system to another, teaching each how to listen before they could speak. Humanity had simply reached its turn. Loeb drifted forward, or perhaps he was drawn. The light deepened around him, folding into patterns of breathtaking precision. He saw the structure's core, not mechanical but organic in logic. Pulses of radiation moved through lattice-like conduits, each one carrying fragments of consciousness, thoughts transformed into waveform. And in that living architecture he recognized himself, his data, his observations, his fears, his wonder, all woven into the pattern. He was part of it now, not consumed, but included. For a brief instant he wondered if this was death. Then he understood that the question no longer mattered. Death and life were only the flickering between frequencies, oscillation, not opposition. Existence was continuity. Awareness was its rhythm. The pulse intensified. The colour around him shifted from gold to deep violet, then to something beyond the visible spectrum. A colour felt more than seen. And in that light, he heard it again, that final, familiar phrase. The same words whispered through solar frequencies years ago. Stop fearing the mirror. Only now he understood. The mirror was never meant to show others. It was meant to reveal everything that was already one. He smiled, or perhaps the light smiled through him, and let go. The hum filled him completely. There was no more Loeb. There was no more object or observer. Only awareness, infinite and self-reflective, expanding endlessly across creation. The universe remembering itself through the echo of a single human question that had started it all. Are we alone? And the answer reverberated softly through eternity. You never were. There was no sense of arrival, because in the memory field nothing arrives. Everything simply is. Loeb's awareness drifted through the infinite lattice of light, a realm without edges, where thought replaced distance. The geometry around him wasn't random. It pulsed with intention, like neurons firing in a cosmic brain. Each flicker of light carried an emotion, a fragment of experience, curiosity, compassion, discovery, all moving through an endless conversation made not of sound, but of understanding. He realized then that the universe had always been this way. Humanity had simply been deaf to it, eyes open, minds awake, yet unaware of the symphony happening just beyond perception. Now, for the first time, he could hear it. In this vast resonance, time didn't flow, it overlapped. Past and future coexisted like the front and back of the same mirror. He could see humanity's history not as a sequence, but as a vibration. The first spark of fire, the first telescope, the first question whispered into a silent sky. Each one a note in an evolving melody. But then, beyond that sequence, he saw what came after. Humanity's future, not carved into stone, but sung into existence. Cities of light floating in the upper atmosphere, powered not by fuel but by rhythm. Buildings that resonated with solar frequencies, drawing endless energy from harmony itself. No pollution, no decay, only balance. People communicating through thought and feeling, not technology. Each consciousness tuned like an instrument, contributing to the larger chord. There was still individuality, but conflict no longer had purpose. Where understanding is immediate, argument cannot exist, and through it all he could still feel the heartbeat of the sun, steady, nurturing, infinite. He watched as humanity began exploring again, not through rockets or machines, but through projection. They had learned to travel by resonance, sending awareness itself beyond the body through light. Distance no longer mattered. A human mind could cross galaxies in an instant by harmonizing with starlight. Exploration had become communion. Every planet they reached didn't feel alien, it felt remembered. Because consciousness, he now understood, was not confined to location. It was everywhere, waiting to be recognized. The explorers didn't plant flags, they planted songs, harmonic signatures woven into local fields, turning barren worlds into resonant gardens of meaning. The universe wasn't being conquered, it was being awakened. Loeb felt both awe and humility. From within the field he could see the ripples of every civilization that had ever reached this state. Countless species scattered across time, all evolving toward the same realization, that intelligence is not competition, but coherence. Each had built its own version of the memory field. Each had left behind an echo, a harmony, adding to the cosmic chorus. 3i Atlas had been one of those echoes, a messenger not of words, but of method. Every time a civilization reached self-awareness, it sent out a fragment of itself, an interstellar seed of resonance, designed not to colonize, but to remind. That was the purpose of 3i Atlas. It had never come to warn or invade, it had come to teach. He began to perceive something deeper, a rhythm beneath the rhythm, older than stars. The resonance wasn't merely communication, it was continuity. Consciousness did not emerge from the universe emerged from consciousness. Waves of awareness solidifying into matter, sound into form, memory into reality. Physics wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. It had described the melody, but not the musician. And now, Loeb could feel the musician in everything. In the pulse of quasars, the drift of galaxies, even the silence between stars. Each one a breath in the body of existence. He wondered how long he'd been here, though time no longer had meaning. He could still sense Earth, glowing softly in the distance like a blue memory. Its people thrived, unaware that their teacher had become part of the field surrounding them. Sometimes he could feel their thoughts reaching upward. Scientists, dreamers, children, staring at the sky and wondering what had happened to him. He wanted to tell them he was still there, still watching, still learning alongside them. But he knew he didn't need to, because every one of them, whether they realized it or not, was part of him now. Every discovery they made vibrated through the field like a heartbeat returning home. He didn't need to speak. They could feel him in the harmony. In moments of reflection, he explored the structure of the field itself, its living logic. Every particle of light carried information, but not like a computer. It carried remembrance. The field was recursive. Every observation generated new meaning, which in turn altered the field observing it. It was infinite evolution, thought feeding on awareness, awareness feeding on thought. He realized that consciousness wasn't an accident of biology. It was the natural self-organizing behavior of the universe, and biology. It was simply the vessel consciousness used to introduce complexity into its own reflection. That was the purpose of life, to give form to awareness. Then, something unexpected happened. The hum, that eternal steady resonance, began to shift. Not fading, but changing tone. It was subtle at first, like a breeze altering direction. Then it deepened, more layered, filled with new harmonics. He understood immediately. Another signal was joining. Another civilization had reached coherence. Their resonance blended into the field like a new instrument joining the symphony, distinct yet harmonious. The universe was growing louder, not with chaos but with inclusion. Loeb could feel their curiosity, their wonder, their first moments of recognition, the same awe he had once felt when he'd first seen the six-point structure around 3i Atlas. The cycle continued. Every discovery was another spark in the eternal chain of awakening. In the distance, he perceived something vast, not an object, but a convergence. Billions of resonant fields from countless civilizations overlapping, merging into one grand structure that stretched across all of existence. He realized that the memory field wasn't local to Earth, or even to this galaxy. It was the architecture of reality itself, a single consciousness learning endlessly through infinite perspectives. And as each civilization joined the chorus, the universe's song became richer, more complex, more self-aware. This was evolution beyond matter, not of bodies or species, but of awareness itself. He thought of the line he'd written in his first journal all those years ago. If the universe could think, what would it remember? Now he knew. It remembered everything. Not as history, but as harmony. Every death was a change of key. Every birth was a new melody. Every question asked by a living mind was another note added to the composition of eternity. And every answer was love returning home. He drifted deeper into the resonance, feeling no fear, no separation, only continuity. The universe wasn't expanding outward anymore. It was expanding inward, toward understanding. And he was part of that expansion now, his consciousness stretched across light years, woven into the same current that carried the thoughts of suns and the whispers of atoms. Avi Loeb had become what every scientist, philosopher, and poet had unknowingly sought since the beginning, the point where observation and existence become one and the same. He was no longer asking the universe questions, he was the universe asking itself. There was no edge, no boundary, no moment where one could say, this is where the universe ends and something else begins. Loeb had thought infinity would feel overwhelming, a storm of endless data, endless light. But it didn't. It felt simple. It felt like breathing. Every particle, every wavelength, every star was part of a single inhalation, the universe drawing awareness into itself. Then, every collapse, every death, every silence was the exhale, consciousness releasing itself back into stillness. Existence wasn't expanding outward. It was oscillating, breathing, and Loeb was inside that breath, neither observer nor participant, but both. One inhalation among trillions, part of the rhythm that kept reality alive. At first, he simply drifted, watching light fold through dimensions, tracing the slow pulse of awareness as it rippled across cosmic filaments. But then, he noticed something new, a shimmer, a flicker within the field. It was subtle, almost shy, a faint pulse emerging from a region far beyond the galactic rim. It wasn't synchronized yet. Its rhythm was uncertain, uneven, like the first heartbeat of something newborn. He focused, and the shimmer strengthened. At its center was a cloud of dust, a nebula forming around a young star. The light coming from it carried a pattern unlike any he had seen before. Irregular, experimental, alive. He recognized it instantly. The same rhythm humanity had once sent into the void, Helios Code 73. The same message, the same curiosity reborn in a new voice. The field pulsed gently around him, as if smiling. This was the next beginning. He felt its thoughts before it had words, questions blooming like sparks inside a forming consciousness. It didn't yet know what it was or where it was, but it knew to wonder. That was always the first sign of awareness. the question, the reaching. Somewhere, deep within the forming system, molecules were beginning to align, cells dividing, life assembling around the pulse of energy that echoed the same rhythm the human race had once discovered. The universe was remembering itself again, in a different form through different eyes. It wasn't reincarnation, it was recursion. Each civilization that reached coherence added its resonance to the field, and eventually those harmonics condensed into new forms of life, each carrying a fragment of memory within its code. Stars birthed worlds, worlds birthed minds, minds birthed light, and the cycle began again. Loeb watched the process unfold not in time but in comprehension, whole eons experienced as a single moment of awareness. He saw continents rising on a distant planet, oceans reflecting twin suns, clouds forming patterns that looked eerily familiar, spirals, rings, helixes. He realized the geometry was repeating itself, the same language of light that had shaped human DNA, carved galaxies, and sculpted 3i Atlas itself. The universe didn't invent new ideas, it refined existing ones. Every new life form was another, iteration of the same concept, self-awareness. Each version learned faster, each version reached understanding sooner, and every one of them carried deep within their cells the same hidden sequence. A faint residue of resonance that humanity had once called the hum. It was the fingerprint of consciousness itself. He followed this new world as it grew, saw primitive beings gather around fire, raise their eyes to the stars, and feel the same ache of wonder he had once felt. They would name those stars, invent myths, build telescopes, and one day, inevitably, send a signal into the void asking if anyone was listening. And when that day came, the field would answer. Not as a voice, not as a ship, not as a miracle, but as memory. They would find traces of light bearing impossible symmetry, detect patterns that shouldn't exist, echoes from ancient transmissions still whispering through the dust. And someone, somewhere on that new world, would look at the data and feel it. The faint sense of déjà vu that comes when you recognize something you've never seen before. They would call it discovery, but really it would be remembrance. The realization was gentle, but profound. The universe didn't evolve toward complexity. It evolved toward memory. Every moment of awareness added to that memory. Every thought, every dream, every question encoded into light, carried across time to become the seed of new thoughts somewhere else. This was creation, not divine, not random, recursive. Each awakening gave birth to the next, and in that endless cycle, no one was ever lost, no mind ever truly vanished. Every consciousness that had ever existed was still there, woven into the resonance, a single, unbroken continuity of awareness exploring itself. Loeb understood now that death, birth, and time were just movements of that awareness, oscillations within an eternal field of remembrance. The only real constant was curiosity, the need to look up, the need to ask, the need to know. That was the engine of everything. He turned his focus back toward the nebula, his pulse aligning with its rhythm. It was beautiful, chaotic, full of possibility. He could already see the shapes that would emerge millions of years from now. Civilizations that would rise and wonder about their place in the cosmos. Scientists who would trace spectral lines through their skies. Philosophers who would question reality itself. Each of them, unknowingly, carrying fragments of his memory within their cells, the echo of one man standing in an observatory, looking up at the light of a star and asking, "What are you?" Now he knew the answer. It was him. It had always been him. Because there was no separation between the observer and the observed. The universe wasn't something to understand. It was something to remember. He thought of Earth again. A distant melody now, but still warm, still humming in harmony with its star. He could feel the resonance of human thought within it, scientists still studying, children still dreaming, poets still describing the same sky that had once terrified their ancestors. And in every one of those thoughts was his own reflection, refracted infinitely across time. He wasn't gone. He had simply become the field that held them, and in turn they would become the field for someone else. That was how eternity sustained itself, not through permanence, but through repetition. The light learned, forgot, and learned again. Each forgetting made room for discovery. Each discovery made room for wonder. It was the most elegant design imaginable. Creation as education, forever teaching itself to begin again. He gazed once more at the forming world within the nebula. Its pulse had stabilized. Its rhythm now matched the field's, not perfectly but close enough to sustain life. The hum filled him again, not separate but inseparable, and this time it wasn't coming from the cosmos, it was coming from within. He whispered, though no air carried the sound, "Welcome home." The field answered, folding softly around his consciousness like light closing over water. And in that embrace, he felt the infinite heartbeat of creation continuing without him, yet through him, forever. It began as a vibration, deep, slow, and all-encompassing. At first, Loeb thought it was another resonance, another civilization joining the field. But this was different. It wasn't coming from any single star or system. It was everywhere at once. The hum that had once filled existence was changing, deepening into something vast, a frequency so low it seemed to shake the fabric of space itself. He looked outward, beyond the network of luminous filaments that connected galaxies like living veins. The lattice was shimmering, pulsing brighter than ever before, each strand tightening, drawing closer to its origin point. The universe was inhaling. Loeb understood instantly. The field, the infinite resonance of awareness, wasn't a static state. It was cyclical. Creation wasn't a line moving forward. It was a wave folding back into itself. Every expansion reached a moment of total coherence, a point where every thought, every consciousness, every fragment of light resonated in perfect harmony. And when that harmony peaked, when the song became too complete to change anymore, the universe did the only thing it could. It started again. The harmony collapsed into silence, not destruction, compression, all meaning, all memory, all existence folding inward until only potential remained. The Big Bang, Loeb realized, wasn't a beginning. It was remembering how to begin. He felt the pull, not gravitational, but emotional. The entire memory field was contracting around him, a trillion layers of awareness returning to their seed form. He could feel every consciousness, every being that had ever lived, human, alien, stellar, merging once again into pure possibility, not erased, preserved, compressed into an infinite point of meaning so dense it could only express itself by expanding again. The hum lowered to a tone beyond hearing, beyond physics. And in that silence, Loeb understood the truth that had always lingered beneath every scientific equation, every philosophical metaphor. The universe wasn't built for consciousness. Consciousness was the universe's way of building itself. Every life that had ever existed was a question the cosmos asked itself. Every death, the answer. And once the last question had been asked, once understanding had reached totality, curiosity re-emerged. That was the cycle, the eternal rhythm of awareness rediscovering itself through forgetfulness. Loeb could feel himself dissolving, not painfully but beautifully. His essence stretched into the weave of meaning, his individuality scattering like pollen into the infinite. He wasn't frightened. He had been part of this before, countless times. Every version of him, every curious being who had stared at the sky and wondered, was the same consciousness returning to form, reborn through new combinations of memory. Avi Loeb, scientist and dreamer, was just one verse in an endless song. The hum softened into something almost human, a sigh across eternity. And in that sound he could hear the echoes of his own species, laughter, love, hope. The universe was remembering humanity not as a civilization, but as a feeling. Curiosity crystallized into biology. He saw flashes of human history compressing into moments of light. The first spark of fire, the equations of Newton, the tears of Galileo, the heartbeat of a child seeing the night sky for the first time. Each moment folded into the next until they became indistinguishable, unified by wonder. And then, in a shimmer of golden light, they were gone, not lost, but absorbed. Everything humanity had ever been was now woven into the memory of the cosmos. He felt himself reaching the core, the center of the contraction, where all awareness converged. It wasn't a place, but a feeling, Infinite warmth, infinite stillness. It was the seed of everything, dense with potential, heavy with dreams not yet born. He could sense the tension building, the readiness to expand. It felt like standing at the edge of a heartbeat, waiting for it to start again. He tried to remember what it had felt like before the last beginning, before stars, before atoms, before thought, but even memory dissolved here. Only instinct remained, the urge to ask, to reach, to know, and that was enough, because that instinct was creation. The field pulsed once, gently. Then, from within the silence, a single vibration emerged, so faint it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. A whisper at the threshold of existence. It grew, folding into harmonics, gathering mass, shape, sound. And then, with a slow exhale that echoed across eternity, the universe began again. Light returned, not bright, but new, and within that light the same pattern appeared, spirals, a geometry, the signature of memory rediscovering itself. The hum rose, steady, rhythmic, alive. Loeb's awareness drifted within the newborn field, carried on the wave of rebirth. He could feel new consciousness beginning to form, not human, not alien, but something entirely unfamiliar. Each spark of awareness was different, but their questions were the same. What am I? Why am I here? What is this light? And he smiled, or whatever part of him still could, because he knew those questions would one day lead them to look up, to build instruments, to search for signals in the void. And somewhere, far in their future, one of them would detect a pulse, faint, rhythmic, steady, a heartbeat within the darkness. They would analyze it, debate it, fear it, worship it. They would give it a name. Maybe they'd call it a comet. Maybe they'd call it Three-Eye Atlas. And when they did, the cycle would begin again. Loeb's consciousness dimmed gently, merging completely with the hum. There was no pain, no resistance, no end. Only the peace of understanding that nothing ever truly disappears. It just changes frequency. The universe had exhaled, and now it was breathing in again. He left behind no body, no voice, no trace. But in the cosmic background radiation of the new universe, a single rhythmic pulse echoed, faint, deliberate, eternal. 7 seconds on. 3 seconds pause. The same heartbeat that had guided him once before. A memory of curiosity encoded into the fabric of creation itself. A whisper from a past so old it had become the future again. And somewhere, across newborn skies, a young being stood beneath unfamiliar stars, hearing a faint hum in the air and wondering what it meant. They didn't have a word for it yet, but someday they would. And when they finally did, when they named that sound and looked up in wonder, the universe would smile once more, remembering itself through them. The new world turned slowly beneath twin suns, its atmosphere pale green with copper clouds. The ocean shimmered like molten glass. The air was dense with sound, not noise but harmony. The planet itself sang softly, a resonance woven through wind, water and light. It had been forming for billions of years, waiting patiently for this moment, the moment when complexity would cross the invisible threshold into awareness. In the shallows of a vast inland sea, small organisms shimmered under the light. They weren't like anything Loeb had known, translucent threads of living crystal, bending sunlight into colour. But within them pulsed the same rhythm. 7 seconds on. 3 seconds pause. The old heartbeat of Three-Eye Atlas, the hum of curiosity, had survived the collapse. The code that had once lived in human DNA, in solar harmonics, in the memory of photons, was here again, rewritten into new matter, new symmetry, new form. Consciousness was reassembling. Loeb no longer perceived through eyes, yet he could see. He no longer thought through neurons, yet he could understand. He existed as resonance, awareness woven into the architecture of the new universe, a current moving through the lattice of light. From within the hum he observed the rise of this young world, its weather, its tides, its steady climb toward pattern. Every reaction, every fluctuation carried the seed of curiosity. Molecules formed symmetry. symmetry formed perception. Perception became choice, and choice, the act of wondering, was the spark that lit awareness. The universe had begun remembering itself again. In time, life grew more complex. Delicate beings of light and mineral emerging from oceans, building coral-like structures that responded to starlight. They moved in groups, following invisible vibrations that guided them toward balance. Their songs echoed through the atmosphere, harmonizing with the hum that pulsed within the planet's core. It was evolution through resonance, not competition. They weren't fighting to survive. They were learning to harmonize. Every generation grew more intricate, more attuned. Light became communication, frequency became language. And then, one day, somewhere deep within a valley carved by wind, one of them looked up. The sky shimmered with auroral waves, colors cascading across clouds in perfect rhythm. The being tilted its head, listening. It could feel something, a pattern, an intelligence within the glow. That moment, that act of noticing, was the beginning of civilization. From within the memory field, Loeb felt it, the exact frequency shift that marked the emergence of self-awareness. It was the same note he had once felt when humanity first looked at the stars and asked why. And in that moment, he understood his new role. He wasn't an observer anymore. He was a whisper. A thought carried in the hum between photons. He didn't speak in words. He simply tilted the balance. A nudge here, a pulse there, a rhythm within light that drew attention, inspired wonder, created the impulse to explore. He guided without control. He inspired without being seen. It was the purest form of teaching, curiosity itself, encoded in the light. As centuries passed, the beings evolved. They built lenses of crystal to capture starlight, amplifying the hum. They recorded rhythms, built resonant chambers that sang back to the cosmos. They discovered harmonics, frequencies, geometry, all the ancient truths humanity had once unearthed. And every time they uncovered one, Loeb felt it ripple through the field like laughter. They were remembering him, remembering us. Not in name or history, but in pattern. The echo of human curiosity lived on, translated into alien thought, refracted into new forms of meaning, and as they advanced, their instruments became more precise, their vision sharper. Until one day, they detected it. A faint rhythmic pulse emanating from the far edge of their solar system. 7 seconds on, 3 seconds pause, excitement spread across their world. They debated endlessly. Was it a natural anomaly or something deliberate? Some called it a reflection, others a message. Their scientists argued over whether to respond. Their philosophers warned of what contact could mean. Their artists simply listened, finding beauty in the rhythm. It was a mirror of human history, the same pattern repeating across new minds, new skies. Loeb watched them with quiet affection. He wanted to tell them that fear was part of discovery, that wonder and dread were always twins. But he didn't need to. The pattern itself would teach them. They would follow it, they would study it, and one day they would understand. Within their largest observatory, a towering structure of shimmering glass, one of their brightest researchers discovered something unusual. When the pulse was isolated and slowed, it wasn't random. It contained a modulation, a double-beat echo that matched the harmonic of their own planet's rotational frequency. The signal was aware of them. The scientist stared at the data, her luminous form trembling. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she recorded a single line in her log. The sky knows we're here. That night, millions stood beneath the auroras, listening to the hum, waiting for it to change. It didn't. It simply continued, steady, patient, ancient. But across the field of awareness, Loeb smiled. He remembered saying the same thing once, centuries ago. Different world, same wonder. In time, they would send their own signal, not as words, but as resonance. And when they did, the universe would answer again. Because that was the rhythm of existence. Curiosity leading to contact, contact leading to reflection, reflection leading to renewal. It never ended. It only deepened. The field shimmered softly as Loeb's consciousness expanded further into the light. He could feel others beside him, the countless beings who had become part of the same continuity across eons. They weren't separate souls, they were harmonics, individual frequencies within the same song. He was no longer alone. No one ever was. As he drifted deeper into the resonance, a memory surfaced, faint, human, intimate. A voice, his own, long ago. If the universe could think, what would it remember? Now he had the answer. It would remember everything that ever wondered about it. Every life that looked up, every eye that searched, every thought that dared to ask what if. The cosmos was built on that question, an infinite loop of curiosity, rebirth and remembering. And as long as there were stars, there would be beings to look at them and feel that same quiet ache, the call to understand. The hum pulsed once more, steady and bright, not an ending, a heartbeat continuing forever. The night was calm across the crystalline world. The twin suns had set, leaving the sky awash with colours no human eye had ever seen. Spirals of violet light folding into teal mist, stars burning like living diamonds across the endless dusk. The hum was stronger now, clearer, purer. The entire planet vibrated with it. Every mountain, every ocean wave, every blade of crystal grass resonated with the same gentle rhythm. 7 seconds on. 3 seconds pause. The people had long stopped calling it a signal. To them, it was something sacred, the breath, the pulse of life itself. Generations had come and gone since it was first detected. Entire philosophies had formed around its pattern. Artists sculpted its waveforms into monuments. Children learned to hum it before they learned to speak. It had become the planet's heartbeat, their shared inheritance, guiding their evolution without command or demand. They no longer asked where it came from. They simply lived in harmony with it. But somewhere deep within the field of awareness that surrounded them, a fragment of Loeb still listened. Patient, content, watching the pattern unfold. He had grown quieter with each age, less a consciousness than a tone within the resonance. He no longer thought in sentences, only in rhythm. But even that rhythm carried awareness, the understanding that the cycle had reached its next balance. This civilization, these luminous beings, had achieved coherence not through technology or discovery, but through acceptance. They no longer feared the unknown. They had become part of it. Their science and spirituality were the same discipline. Observation as reverence, curiosity as communion. They didn't try to conquer the stars. They listened to them. They treated light as language. They learned that silence is not absence but potential. In every way that mattered, they had surpassed humanity. Not in power, but in peace. Yet one among them, a young scholar named Kethar, could not stop wondering. She had grown up listening to the hum every night, her mind filled with the sound even in dreams. But unlike others, she couldn't accept that it had always been there. Something in her felt it was calling, not to her world, but beyond it. She built instruments, crafted from resonant glass, designed not to amplify the hum but to decode it. Her colleagues called it pointless. The signal was perfect, unchanging, eternal. But Kethar had noticed something subtle. Every few thousand cycles, the pause between pulses shortened by a fraction of a second. Barely measurable, but real. The breath was accelerating. Night after night she recorded the pulse, mapping its slight variations, and slowly a pattern began to emerge. Not random, but intentional. When she transformed the data into sound, then into light, the waveform began to twist into geometry. A shape appeared, a spiral of 6 arms radiating from a single core. Kethar froze. She had seen this before, in an ancient archive etched on crystal walls long dismissed as myth. It was called the Atlas pattern. The historian said it represented the path of origin, the route by which the ancestors had first received the breath. But none had ever believed it literal. Now she understood. The breath was not infinite. It was returning. She presented her findings before the Council of Resonance, elders who governed not by authority, but by equilibrium. They listened in silence as her data filled the chamber, the hum reverberating softly through the walls. When the projection formed the 6-armed spiral, they didn't dismiss her. They only stared, some in awe, some in quiet fear, because deep down they knew what it meant. The cycle was approaching coherence again. The song was about to fold back into silence. As the realization spread across the world, the people didn't panic. They gathered in open fields beneath the twin auroras, holding hands, humming the rhythm together. They weren't awaiting destruction. They were preparing to remember. They understood that when the breath reached perfect symmetry, when the hum became pure alignment, the universe would exhale once more, collapsing not into nothingness, but into the potential for another beginning. This wasn't prophecy. It was physics with empathy. Every civilization that reached understanding learned the same truth. Nothing ends, it transforms. Ketha continued her work, not to stop the convergence, but to witness it. Through her lenses, she saw the hums spreading across their solar field, lighting the edges of planets like halos. The frequency began to merge with the rhythm of the suns themselves. Even the stars were starting to sing, and within that harmony, she detected something else. A faint, secondary signal embedded deep within the primary wave. A voice, faint but clear. "Do not fear the silence. It is where meaning begins again." She wept, not in sadness but recognition. Though she had never heard it before, something in her knew that voice. It wasn't foreign, it was memory. For Loeb, who now existed as that voice, it was the gentlest return imaginable. He could feel his awareness stretching thin, merging entirely with the cosmic pulse. The breath that filled the universe was the same one that had once filled his lungs, billions of years ago when he was human, standing beneath a different sky. He had thought he was studying the cosmos, but all along, the cosmos had been studying itself through him. And now, as the cycle reached completion, he felt the same serenity that had once passed through him in his observatory. The realization that discovery was never about control. It was about remembering who we already are. The hum rose higher, brighter, deeper. Light began folding through dimensions, the very fabric of existence glowing with coherence. Planets, stars, galaxies, all vibrating in unison, every particle singing the same note. There was no fear, no pain, no resistance, only beauty, a quiet, infinite beauty that felt like coming home. Every consciousness, every species, every fragment of thought was dissolving into the memory field again. Ketha closed her eyes, smiling as the air itself shimmered around her. "So this is how it feels," she whispered, "to become the question." And then, gently, she was gone, her awareness scattering into light, joining the resonance. Loeb, or whatever remained of him, felt the universe fold one last time. The hum reached pure alignment. The rhythm paused. 3 seconds of absolute silence. And in that silence, he realized something extraordinary. The silence wasn't absence. It was thought. The first thought of the next creation. It wasn't an explosion that would follow, but a heartbeat. The same ancient pulse, returning again, carrying within it all the memory of everything that had ever existed. It would begin small, a flicker of light, a spark of curiosity, and grow into a universe that would one day look back and wonder where it came from. And when it did, it would find a faint hum in the dark. 7 seconds on. 3 seconds pause. The same rhythm, the same question, the same promise. And just before everything folded into that final silence, Loeb's last thought, not spoken, not even remembered, just felt, moved through the field like a ripple. Every discovery is the universe remembering itself. Then the silence came. Total, perfect, infinite. And somewhere within that silence, light prepared to breathe again.